Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Audra Montenegro with O'Reilly Media and will be your host for today's webcast. Today we have Jonathan Stark, and he is going to talk to you about modern web design with progressive enhancement, responsive design, and CSS3. Jonathan is a mobile consultant, web evangelist, and confessed techno-utopian who believes that wireless computing will transform every aspect of human society. Jonathan is the author of 3 books on mobile and web development, most notably O'Reilly's Building iPhone Apps with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which is available in 7 languages. His Jonathan's Card experiment made international headlines by combining mobile payments with social giving to create a pay-it-forward coffee movement at Starbucks locations all over the U.S. Okay, everyone. As we get our webcast started, I would like to go over some housekeeping tips to help you get the most out of today's event. First, you'll want to open the group chat widget if you haven't already done so. This is where we'll interact with each other during the event and where you'll submit your questions for Jonathan. We find that our audience usually has a lot of good knowledge to share, so we encourage you to chat freely during the event. However, if you have questions for Jonathan, please be sure to preface them with a capital letter Q so we know that it is for him and we can make sure he sees it for Q&A. You can also open, move, and resize any of the other widgets. If you would like to tweet from the Twitter widget, you will need to give it permission to access your account. Our hashtag today is VelocityConf, all one word, and the Twitter widget will automatically append that to your tweet so you don't have to. If you have any problems during the event, we encourage you to look at the help widget, which is very thorough. If you continue to have problems, post in the chat room and one of our staff will help you. For choppy audio or stalled visuals, try refreshing your window, and remember that the best thing you can do for a good audio stream is closing any apps that could be interfering. Because people always ask, we would like to let you know that we are recording today's webcast and will have an archive available usually within 48 hours. All right, and folks, at this time, it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Jonathan for his presentation. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, how are you? Thanks for the intro.
We have people from all over the world joining us.
I know, it's very exciting. Welcome, everyone. I am super psyched to talk to you today about sort of modern web design and development with progressive enhancement, responsive design, and CSS3. Today we are going to, you probably pick up tips and tricks from the code that I showed today, but really what I want you to take away from this is an overall understanding of the approach that I'm using. So what I'm going to do is start off with essentially a goal of creating a sort of interactive animated slideshow and show you how I would build it sort of from beginning to end. And like I said, there'll be things about the code that you might be like, why did he do it like that? And that's not really what we're going for here. Really, what I want you to show is that what I really want you to learn is the iterative approach that I take to the project. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. There are no slides today. I'm just going to be sharing my screen and showing actual markup and CSS and JavaScript. So it usually takes just a second to get the screen share open. So bear with me for a moment. And while that's starting, I want to start off by saying that I'm assuming everybody on the call is a web designer or web developer or someone who manages those sorts of people. What we have here is just a super simple web page. And so what I want to do is kind of take you through the visual first, and then I'll show you what's behind the scenes, and then I'll follow that pattern as I improve the page more and more. So what you're looking at here is just a plain HTML-only web page, no CSS or anything. And our ultimate goal is to get to a slideshow type experience that looks like this with animations and some fade in and out of the controls. And I can't really show you this on my phone, but this will work also on your phone. And I want to show you how I get from this big white thing with huge images to that more snazzy version of the slideshow. Okay, so everything you're seeing here, the content is all just lorem ipsum placeholder content, but I wanted to put the slideshow in the context of sort of like a page type of thing and give you an idea of my approach. All right, so if I got a design from a client, I've recently worked with a couple of global brands on responsive web redesigns and took this sort of extreme progressive enhancement responsive approach with them, and it's worked really nicely. So to start off, our baseline HTML, I'll just use source on this. I've got some basic HTML5 boilerplate. You can get that from html5boilerplate.com, I believe is the URL. And it's just got a page wrapper, H1 with the sort of home link, really nothing exciting here. But the thing that's important about this is that it's semantic HTML. So you can, if this content was delivered to a device that didn't even support JavaScript or CSS, it would still render in a way that was, usable. You could navigate to this page on a really, really bad phone, and if it didn't even have CSS or if the CSS was stripped, you'd still be able to make sense out of the page. It wouldn't be the greatest experience, but you've got this first slide, you get this next slide displayed just this long running list. So it's probably not fair to call this slideshow, but it's a list of images with captions. So it would be usable on a device that was really weak. It's also nice for devices that aren't what you would normally consider browsing devices. So you could think like Google would crawl this page and be able to easily make sense out of it. Screen readers would be able to easily make sense out of this. Other devices that are constantly more and more as long as they can render HTML, they'd be able to make sense of this page. But it's certainly pretty ugly. So usually what I'll do, the first step is just create a sort of nice structured semantic HTML like we have here. And then the next thing I do is apply basic designs and styles to it. So here I would apply type treatments and some colors, but not so much like not so much layout, not too much padding, just really light style. So you come to a page that here I've just applied some simple CSS that we'll look at in 1 second, and I've made the slides a lot easier to read. I've made them scale with the window so that the computer's lagging a little. Scale with the window so they fit in the viewport, so they're not overflowing like crazy, like we saw in the first version. So you can imagine on a pretty small phone screen. Again, this is an even more usable experience. Nothing fancy yet, but you could certainly come to this page with JavaScript turned off, and the CSS would convert the semantic HTML into a relatively pleasing experience. Certainly very usable. So let's look quickly at what's going on here. One second. Computer's fighting with me. Hold on a sec.
And remember, people, if you have any questions for Jonathan, please preface them with a capital letter Q and put them in the chat log. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Audra. Sorry, folks. Computer's not playing nice. Hang on. Let me try and kill some stuff. Hopefully it'll come out of it in a second. not even letting me force quit.
And folks, to thank you for attending today's webcast, we have a special offer from O'Reilly Media. You can get Jonathan's ebooks for 50% off or print books for 40% off. Just use code WCYAZ. And the links are there in the chat log.
Here we go. Hopefully it's clearing now. Let's see if that helps. All right, sorry about that. Looks like we might be back in business here. Want to view source on this? All right. So here in the HTML for this sort of fancier page, I haven't changed anything, but I do have a couple of classes added in for the slideshow itself. We've got the unordered list of slides. It's in a wrapper called slideshow, and that's relevant because we're going to look at the CSS now. If we can. Here we go. All right, so here's the CSS for this page. It's very simple, very short. It's about 60 lines of CSS. And it's nothing really to write home about, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. I just apply some font information, some sizing, that kind of thing. I set some colors and border. And yeah, nothing really fancy here. The one thing I want to point out is down at the bottom, where I've got some slideshow-specific style rules. And notice in these selectors that they are prefixed with this no-js, slideshow HTML. And I'll show you, you probably didn't see, but in the actual HTML for the page, at the very top in the HTML tag, the open HTML tag, I hard-coded this class no.js. So if someone loads this page and they don't have JavaScript enabled, it's going to stay there. So these files that these rules down here are going to be applied. In an upcoming example, I'm going to include some JavaScript that will remove that no.js so that our CSS will know that we are in an environment that does render CSS. But this non-JavaScript version of the CSS is my second step when going through a new project. All right. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start to get a little bit fancier with the layout. And in this example, you can see I've collapsed the slides so that now they are in a horizontal orientation, and I can mouse over them and scroll them left and right. So this is kind of cool because it sort of gets me back it gets me closer to above the fold, so to speak. It gets me more efficient use of the layout, and it still gives access to all of the slides and a little bit more slide-like experience. So if we look at a couple of things to look at here. First, I'll show you go back to the index page because I made some changes to the index page here. First thing to notice is that the HTML tag has a whole bunch of new classes in it, just a ton of them. And those are added because I included a JavaScript library called Modernizer in the project now. And what Modernizer does is it sort of does a little bit of JavaScript magic to check and see what sort of support there is in the particular browser that the user is in. And whatever is supported or isn't supported, it adds classes to the HTML so that we can then put hooks and selectors into the CSS that will behave differently depending on what's supported. So this is a very simple feature detection type of approach to progressive enhancement that is a great way to do things, and I use it all the time. All right, so now you notice that Modernizer recognized that this page does have JavaScript enabled. So it changed that Node.js to just plain old JS. So now in my CSS, I can easily apply different styles in a situation where JavaScript isn't supported. There are plenty of other things here that are useful, like no touch. I won't do it in this example, in this particular webinar, but you can imagine having different styles for touch and non-touch interfaces. For example, if you wanted to make your touch targets larger on touch devices, you could do that easily with this class provided by Modernizer. And I'll be adding a couple of more Modernizer checks as we go through this. All right. So now also, down at the bottom, if we look at the raw source, not the modified DOM, which we're looking at here, if we look at the raw source, you will see that I've included let's see if I can get this up here. I've included a sort of dynamic script tag at the bottom. And there are lots of different ways to do this. This is just one example. But down at the bottom, I am dynamically writing in the link to my JavaScript file that we're going to be looking at in the next couple of examples. And I did it like this so that a browser that doesn't support JavaScript wouldn't even wouldn't even make the HTTP request. It wouldn't even download main.js because this script right here would never run and do this document write. There are lots of different ways to do this. You can use fnope, you can use Modernizer. This is just one simple way I wanted to illustrate the concept with. So basically conditionally loading JavaScript depending on whether or not the browser has JavaScript available. All right, so let's look at the CSS for this particular example because there's a couple of interesting things. If we jump over to resources, and most of the things are the same up at the top. And farther down, you see the Node.js stuff. I left that alone. And then I added a bunch of JS styles. So a couple of things to note. In particular, the overflow scroll here, overflow X scroll, which is what makes this be able to scroll, and also that I'm displaying the slide as inline block. So there's a couple of things working together to make this scroll work. One is the horizontal scrolling, overflow X scroll. The other is that I've got white space no wrap on the unordered list that contains these things, these slides. And then I'm saying of each slide I want it to be inline block, which is basically the way an image would get displayed. So it's a block element, but they kind of like float left. So with just a teeny bit of CSS and a little bit of sniffing on the part of Modernizer to say that, hey, we're in a browser that supports JavaScript, I already know that I'm in a decently powerful environment, and I can probably safely do something like overflow X and white space no wrap, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, if these things failed, it would still be usable. It would just fall back to either my earlier CSS, or it would fall back to just plain HTML, and we'd still be able to consume this content. I should point out that here for the sake of simplicity, I'm just using the WebKit overflow. Oh, I didn't even talk about this yet. Let's look at line 72, WebKit overflow scrolling touch. Normally I would have all the vendor prefixes here, but I just wanted to keep it simple for the sake of the discussion. But what this does is that on mobile, in particular, in this case, iPhone, let's say, iOS, or an iPad or whatever, what this does is it creates the sort of bounce effect that you get with vertical scroll, but in any element in either direction. So when you have WebKit overflow scrolling touch turned on, you get a nicer experience. If we were looking at this on a phone without that, your finger would slide it left and right, but as soon as your finger left the screen, it would stop abruptly, which is not what people are used to. So if you add that overflow scrolling touch, it gets a little bit more rubber bandy, physics type of response, which is really nice. And you get it for free. And if it doesn't work, on, say, like a Kindle Fire or an older Android device, no big deal. You can still scroll it back and forth, and it's still usable. So this is just another example of progressive enhancement. We'll also see when we start looking at the JavaScript file that I could explicitly check for this to see if I wanted to add this, see if there was support for this, and I could additionally add something to the selector that said something like supports touch or supports overflow scrolling, and just have this rule run on devices that it would work on. But since if it fails, it doesn't matter if it fails, so I just left it like this. All right. So already our page is getting a little bit nicer. Let's switch up to the next example, where I wanted to give an example of, this is a very basic sort of responsive web design example. This isn't really an in-depth drill down on responsive web design, but I did want to point a couple things out. So you can see here I've got a very wide window, and the text is too small, the lines are too long, and you could fix all those things. Just throw a grid in here and make that the way you wanted it. What I wanted to illustrate is that I can float this right and kind of treat the slideshow as an image in a way, and have it over here. You could have it in the sidebar or whatever you want. And then when I switch it into a smaller mode, if you will, smaller screen width, let's see if it wants to behave. There we go. I have media queries in the CSS that sort of conditionally change the display slightly. So let's look at that real quick. If we scroll down to the bottom of the CSS, you can see that I've added a media query, and I say I want at a min width of 50 ems. So once the window is up to 50 ems, don't do anything. But then as soon as I hit 50 ems, what I want to do is apply these additional styles. So I give the slideshow a background color, I put a border around it, I float it right, I give it a little left margin, I give it a max width, a little padding, and that kind of thing, and I modify the slides somewhat. So it's nothing radical, of course, but it's just meant to be an example for you to say, how would you do that in a sort of responsive way, or how does responsive design fit into this, or at least the media query part of responsive web design. This approach is responsive web design friendly, I guess what I'm trying to say. All right. Here's another example where I get a little bit fancier. So now I know I'm in a situation where I've got JavaScript, because Modernizer has modified the classes on the HTML tag. So here what I'm going to do is start adding some user interface to this, so it's a little bit more like what you'd think of as a traditional slideshow or a carousel, where I've got next and previous buttons, and there's no left-right scrolling. It's just this one current slide. And these buttons don't do anything yet. I've just created some JavaScript to make the appearance of what the slideshow is going to be like. So here, now we've got some JavaScript to look at. This is the first time we've got any JavaScript going on. Up until now, well, Modernizer is JavaScript, but this is the first time we're going to write any JavaScript. And here I've got my main.js file, pasted in a minified version of jQuery up at the top, so we can use a sort of jQuery approach to this. I don't ever use jQuery just by default, but I figured for this talk, there's so many people on the line, I figured that tons of people will be familiar with jQuery. And if you know how to write JavaScript without using jQuery, then you'll easily be able to re-envision this with just sort of broad JavaScript, whereas vice versa might not be as true. So So I decided to use jQuery in this case for educational purposes, but I wouldn't necessarily just slap it into every project. It does make things easier to read, though, that's for sure. So let's look through this real quick. So lines 1 through 6 is just jQuery pasted in to my JavaScript file. And then on line 8, I'm doing a sort of a conditional. It's kind of a dumb conditional right now, but it's going to grow as we go through this. But basically on line 8, I'm saying, okay, if jQuery is defined, then we can do this stuff. And the thing I want to illustrate here is that I'm checking if something exists, namely jQuery, before I start using it. And like I said, we'll see this grow and become more relevant as we move on. It's kind of dumb right now because jQuery obviously exists. I just put it in. So, but the concept is here. I grab a reference to the slideshow, and then I add a hook. We say, okay, I'm going to add a class to the slideshow, and say, oh, it's slideshowified, and then I'll append some UI elements to it, and I'm going to set the width of the slide based on the size of the slideshow itself. So let me drill into that a little bit more. The class is added so that I can apply styles to these elements right here that I add in. So I'm adding in an X and Y thing up at the top, so it'll say slide 1 of 5. And I'm adding some next previous controls at the bottom. They're just nothing really fancy to look at there. It's just a next button and next link and a previous link down here. And you can see they're styled. This one is the header is pinned to the top. It's black background with white text. The next previous buttons are pinned to the bottom. There's hover styles on them. So if we look in the CSS, we'll see down at the bottom I've added another section called slideshowified. And that starts on line 114, and it can say, okay, if the slideshow has been slideshowified, I need to change a bunch of things, because now all of a sudden, instead of being this scrolling ribbon type of thing, we're going to have a fixed sort of window into the slides, and I need to style that a little bit differently. So, this is all basic JavaScript. I don't think there's anything unusual here. Just looking, yeah, none of this is unusual none of this is unusual CSS, so there's nothing really to report. It's just I'm applying the layout based on this hook from my JavaScript that says, we've checked the browser environment. It's robust enough to handle some slightly more fancy CSS and JavaScript, so here's where that stuff is. All right, but it still doesn't do anything. If I click on one of these, then it's just going to do nothing. So there's one thing I want to illustrate before I leave this page, though. Since one of the things that's tricky is getting the correct width for a slide. I find it easiest to just programmatically set it, which is what I'm doing on line 22, where I say, okay, how wide is the slideshow window itself? And that's how big I want each slide to be. And that'll become more important as we move on. But the problem with this is I'm only calculating it at page load time. So if I increase the window, I start to see the other slides off to the right. And we definitely don't want that. So the next example, as I resize the window, unless it's broken. As I resize the window, it recalculates that width so that I'm always getting the view that I want. I don't want to see any underlap, if you will. So if we look at the JavaScript to handle this, I've added this calculate sizes function that starts on line 29. And here, it's the same exact logic. I just calculate it inside of this function. And then on line 27, I listen for the window resize event, and I recall the calculate sizes function. So every time, as the window is resizing, it's recalculating the width. If you're familiar with the concept of debounce or throttle, you're probably freaking out right now, because it's not good practice to actually fire every single time the window moves. You probably resizes. You probably want to fire it, either throttle it and fire it only every couple of milliseconds, or a couple, some portion of a second, or when a time lapse has appeared or has elapsed since the resize has stopped. So you can set a timeout, for example, and when the window stops resizing, then you can fire the calculate sizes. But that's sort of beside the point. I just wanted to illustrate that almost always with a responsive project that has any kind of sophisticated user interface widget element, you're going to have to recalculate some stuff when the window resizes. So say when someone changes the orientation of their phone and they get landscape versus portrait, or they resize their browser window, or what have you. It's extremely common to have to add this sort of calc size function. All right, so now we've got that all in place. Now it's time to actually wire up the buttons, wire up the JavaScript to make the navigation work. In this particular example, number 7, if you click on these buttons, it just snaps to the next slide. If you go over the end, it snaps back to the first one. You can obviously see the slides are changing, the captions are changing, and it's not incredibly sexy, but it does work. And as we've seen all along, we've been layering and layering and layering all of this enhancement on. So if someone visits this in a browser that's not supported, it's just gonna enhance as much as it can, and then stop right there. So someone visiting this on an older BlackBerry or real old Android, they might get a different experience than somebody on an iPhone. But the important thing is that they can still get to the content. It doesn't just fall over. So if we look at the JavaScript here, it's starting to get a little more complicated, but it's not too bad, I don't think. All right, so we have to do a few things. Namely, we have to update the header. So we need to know how many slides we have, and we need to know which one we're on. So I defined some variables for that. On line 15, we just assume that when you come to the page, you're going to start on the first slide, which are 0 indexed in this case. And then I count how many slides there are by looking for that slide class. And I changed in this example, and as is often the case as you're layering more and more enhancement onto something, you're going to a lot of times refactor your class names or refactor your code. There are lots of places in the CSS where I could combine things, but for the sake of this talk, I kept them very separate so you could digest them individually. So here, instead of being slideshowified, what I did was I had fancy. I decided to call it fancy and no fancy, kind of in the pattern of JavaScript. No JavaScript. If you look at the source code for this, the HTML, I should say, on the slideshow itself, I added this no fancy class. And again, this is the same concept as having this in the HTML, having the where are you? HTML Node.js right here. So this is where the conditional starts to get important. So it starts off with this no fancy. So we're going to get the no fancy CSS, which if we look at the CSS file, I've changed from slideshowified to no fancy. So I want these styles to happen if I'm in a no fancy situation, in a not fancy browser. But if I am in a fancy browser, I want to remove that and then add fancy as a class. So now my CSS is going to hook into, it's going to switch into fancy mode, so to speak, and apply the fancier styles that this JavaScript is expecting. Okay, so that at the top, we've got this 1 of 5. It's pretty straightforward, I think. Just use this update header function. Down here on line 86, I just write the HTML into that little div, and it displays properly. We've still got the window resize and all that. is all very short JavaScript, but the next previous buttons are worth taking a quick look at. What I do is on line 41, I use jQuery to grab a reference to the slideshow itself, the container wrapper, and I say on click, call this function handle click. And this is a pattern that I use a lot and I'm very happy with. So rather than attaching handlers to individual buttons or other things inside of the slideshow, which aren't dynamic in this case, but you could imagine a situation where I was adding slides or they got to the end of the slideshow and I navigated to the next slideshow. If we aren't sure what all might be inside of the wrapper, it's really convenient to just attach one handler to the wrapper itself that you know is not going to disappear or change or whatever, and then listen for the click there. And then inside of the handle click function, you make some decisions about what you need to do based on what got clicked. So inside of the handle click function, I say prevent default because these are links and I don't want them to update the URL. And I grab a reference to the target of the clicked element. So the event object that gets passed into the handle click function is whatever the mouse touched, basically, or the finger touched. And then based on, in this case, what class that thing has, I'm going to do something. So if the target has class next, which the next button does, then I'm going to call the go to next slide function. And by the same token, I'm going to do the same with previous. So each one of the, these are very simple. I just calculate what the next slide should be or what the previous slide should be, and then I pass that into the go to slide function. And this is the key function that's going to get bigger in the upcoming examples. Starts on line 61. You pass in an index to go to slide. It updates the current one globally, and then it adds an active class to, it removes an active class if there is one on any of the slides, and then it adds the active class to the appropriate one, and then it updates the header. So what that means is if we look at the, you'll be able to see this in the HTML. If we look in the slideshow, you can see the 5 slides. The first one has an active class, and as I click the next button, the active class moves, and just very simply in the CSS, slides are hidden by default right here, display none, and then display block for active. So it doesn't matter, previously up to this point, I did have the slides, pushed sort of horizontally out to the right. Now I'm not even showing them except for the current one. So very, very simple, and this is extremely robust. I'm not using anything fancy at all to do this. So this would work all over the place. This would be a very reliable experience in many, many contexts. So still probably, I don't think anyone would call this sexy or magical or anything like that, but it's very usable and it would work all over the place. But hey, I think we can make it a little bit better. Let's look at the next example. Now here, you could imagine a situation where the caption is covering up too much of the picture, and the person wants to get a better view of the picture. Maybe the caption's really tall. And here what I've added is that you can tap on the slide or click on the slide to fade out the chrome, I'm calling it, so that the elements that are sort of less important, the controls, those sorts of things. So you can actually fade them out by tapping on the link, tapping anywhere in the slideshow that isn't already a control. This is fairly simple, as a matter of fact. It uses CSS3 and the same sort of approach as we've been doing before. So now remember, I've got the whole slideshow. Look at line 41. I've got the whole slideshow listening for clicks. Now, if you look down in the handle click, I've got an extra conditional in here. So if the target has class next or previous, then I'm going to go to next or previous. But if it doesn't, and I click somewhere else, then I'm going to call this toggle Chrome function. And you might expect that I'm then in this toggle Chrome function, you might expect that I'm going to do some fade out jQuery shenanigans, but I don't do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is just toggle a class on the slideshow itself that says hide Chrome or removes hide Chrome. So if we look at the elements, drill into this. If you look at the slideshow, you can see right now that the classes are slideshow and fancy. If I tap on this, it says hide Chrome. That's all the JavaScript does. It just toggles that class. So then inside the CSS, I can decide what hide Chrome means. So the designer could then come in, if you had a separate designer, the designer could come in and decide and change the way the Chrome hides. It could snap away, it could just disappear, it could be display none. But what I'm doing here is actually changing the opacity. So down here on line 172, I've added a WebKit transition, and again, you want to use all the vendor prefixes that are available, but I just use WebKit for now. And I'm saying, okay, if I've got a fancy slideshow and any Chrome elements, any elements of Chrome, I want to have a WebKit transition where the opacity changes over a half a second. And then explicitly set it to opacity 1, which is the default anyway. And then if the hide Chrome class comes into play, gets applied to that object, you just set the opacity to 0. Simple as that. So with maybe a few lines of JavaScript and a few lines of CSS, all of a sudden I have a starting to approach sexy little feature. If we look at the, I guess the only other thing to point out is that in the HTML, I did add the Chrome class to the caption. Sorry, and again, this is somewhere where a designer or someone who's authoring the HTML doesn't have to sort of coordinate with the JavaScript developer. If these are all separate people, they can just say, you know what, when a user toggles the Chrome, I don't want the caption to disappear. So they just leave that class off of the p tags. So it's very easy for a sort of non-programmer, if you will, to basically make a lot of decisions and do a lot of styling and design based on just that single class name toggling on and off. So very cool. All right, but now the moment that everyone's probably been waiting for, we want to change this so that we have a sexier experience, so that we actually get slide animation to give the user a sense of context that they're moving through the slideshow. And then when you get to the end, it slides all the way back to the beginning real quick. And same with the previous. So if we look at the JavaScript for this, let's see, back to JavaScript. It's a little more complicated. I actually, from a conceptual standpoint, I switched back to that sort of long horizontal strip of slides because now we have to do that, where in the previous example I was just display block and display none in order to snap from slide to slide, because that was the easiest way to create that experience. If we're going to upgrade that and make it even fancier, I could, theoretically, I could check for support for CSS transitions, and I could add like a sexy, no sexy class to the slideshow and add that, but I don't really need to because it'll just, the transition, if it just fails, it's just going to snap to the next slide anyway. So what do we have going on here? I think the only interesting thing is inside of the go to slide action. And as I'm going to the slide, it's a little confusing because the slides are sliding, but if we go to the slide and we pass in an index, what it does is it says, puts a WebKit transition on there. I could just as easily have done this in the CSS if I wanted to, if I did want to do it that way, put it in the control of the designer. Sometimes you don't want to put certain functional types of CSS in the designer's control because they could change one thing and break a whole widget. So generally what I do is things that really shouldn't be touched and are structural, CSS bits that are structural, I usually keep in the JavaScript, and the stuff that can be changed freely, I leave in the CSS, but it's a tangent there. But all I'm doing is saying I want the left of, the left of the strip of slides to move over one slide width every time. So I'm just resetting the left CSS property. And when it resets, since I have this WebKit transition, it does it in an animated fashion. Okay, you can still toggle your stuff, toggle your Chrome. Now here's an interesting bit to consider. Since I'm setting my left based on the current slide width, and I'm programmatically setting my slide widths, I have to update the resize function, the calc sizes function, so that it goes to slide 0 when it recalculates, because otherwise it'll resize the slide and it'll resize the it'll resize the slide and it'll resize the slideshow itself, but then the positioning would be off. So the amount that it has been shifted to the left will be off. So I could calculate that too inside of calculate sizes, but rather I just, on resize, it just switches back to this first slide. So if we go to slide 5 and change the window, it slides back. But you could certainly modify this code to be more, to go to the specific slide that it was on. So you could go to slide current or whatever. Okay. So now I've added a few things in here that that we should be checking for. I've added a few things without really making sure that I have support for them. Most of them, I think 100% of them, if they break, it won't actually break. If the transition, for example, doesn't work, it'll just switch to the next slide. It won't animate. So you don't really have to check for that. But I wanted to point out that you will oftentimes do things that you do have to check for. So I've updated this line 9 to explicitly say that if I have support for opacity, and this is the syntax for using Modernizer to check for a particular feature, say, hey, Modernizer, if I have opacity support and CSS transition support, then I do want to run all this fancy stuff. If I don't, just nothing's going to happen, and they're going to get the basically the no JavaScript version, which I believe is here. So that's a little bit draconian, but what I'm trying to do is illustrate the point that along the way, you'll have more and more of these sort of conditionals to say, hey, if I've got all of this stuff, then give the maximum sexy experience. If I've only got a few of them, then give the fancy one. If I've got less than that, then give the lesser, and on down the line. But what's important is that the really key thing that I want you to take away from this is the order that I built these things in. I started small, narrow width with the semantic HTML. I layered in some simple CSS. I layered in some simple JavaScript, and we worked up, 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 up. If I started out just building this experience, and I was only testing on an iPhone, let's say, or a really modern browser, and then I had to go backwards and go down, you can probably imagine, you probably had the experience that you end up in this situation where you're just forever trying to squash bugs, doing all sorts of user agent sniffing to say, oh yeah, this thing breaks on Kindle Fire, and you get in this endless whack-a-mole situation of trying to hunt down bugs to support these weaker experiences, because you started with an assumption of a powerful device and probably authored your HTML and CSS in a way that that makes it very difficult to support weaker devices. With CSS and JavaScript, there's lots of ways to skin the cat, and if you start on the sort of weak end of the spectrum and work your way up, you'll end up with a code base that is incredibly resilient. And when you then take this and start testing it on multiple devices, when I take this approach and I test on multiple devices, old Nokias, whatever, I am routinely shocked by how perfectly everything works at some level of fanciness. So at every point, the user can access the content, And for people that have really powerful modern devices, a brand new iPhone, a brand new Android phone, or what have you, they get this a much more polished experience. If we had more time, I would add in swipe support, and we'd start testing on phones. So first I would swipe to go next previous, and then I would do sticky finger swipe to actually have the image follow your finger while you were sliding it from left to right. But the level of complexity starts to really ramp up as you get to these fancier and fancier and fancier features. At any point here, you can sort of leave off and have a very robust experience. All right, so I should probably leave off there. I'm sorry we had some technical difficulties there. I'm happy to stay a little long if people want to continue to ask questions, but we've got about 2 minutes for questions if Roger wants to switch over.
All right. Yes, we do have quite a few questions. We'll ask a couple here. Let's see here. Darren would like to know, how does one test all of the permutations for progressive enhancement and mobile? Is there a recommended browser suite and or plugins that make this easier?
Couple of quick answers there. First, you're never making a project in a vacuum. There's always a client, whether it's you or someone else. So the first question is, what devices do you explicitly want to support? And they are always going to say iPhone. They might also say particular Android devices. And then they'll design for those. And then all of the sort of steps along the way that I've kind of been describing here, the client the client probably doesn't care about them, and then will be pleasantly surprised when they kind of just work, when they somehow experience their own website on somebody's older phone. That said, the answer there is you're going to probably have some devices that you agree in advance to test on. Another answer there is to use something like Adobe Edge, which is kind of like a shadow browser. So as you navigate around on your desktop, it's actually updating all of your connected devices so that you don't have to go to each page on each device over and over and over. That's an incredibly useful tool. So I guess the general approach is to pick some target devices, maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 specific devices, medium-sized tablets, large tablets, a couple of phones. Test on those using something like Adobe Edge or just manually.
Excellent. We have another question here from Ravi Sara. How would browsers that don't understand media queries react to the styling rules wrapped in a media query? Yeah,
so it's a very good question, and something I'm glad that was brought up. I specifically used a min-width media query in my media queries because the conventional wisdom is the first media query is no media query. So if you follow the approach that I demonstrated here, if you get to a device that doesn't support media queries, they're going to get essentially the default experience. So it would look like this, assuming they had no Java. I mean, if they can't support media queries, it's a fairly weak browser. So they're going to get something like this. If you're worried about older versions of IE, there are polyfills that you can use to add media query support to IE desktop browsers. So I would put conditional comments in if you wanted to use a polyfill like that, and that sort of thing. But generally, if media query support is not there, you're probably on a phone, and therefore a standard HTML with simple CSS is going to be the safer experience, the one that will give people access to the content, which is the main goal.
All right, another question here from Solace. You mentioned you don't use jQuery frequently. What are your preferred libraries, or do you usually use raw.js in production?
It depends on the project. My default position is I'm not going to include any libraries and write everything from scratch, because libraries almost by definition have to include code that I probably won't use. And since I'm always worried about mobile, I'm always doing mobile projects or responsive projects that need to worry about mobile, I prefer to keep the code base as small as possible. So I generally try to just write raw JavaScript. I will only use a library if, A, it's going to be included in the website anyway. So if I'm like using the last couple of projects I've done were WordPress projects that were going to use jQuery anyway for other things. So if it's there anyway, I'm going to use it. But generally when I create my own, if I'm doing something myself, or it's a single-page app, or it's a phone gap application that's only going to go out to iPhone and Android, then I'll just write raw JavaScript just to keep the size down.
All right, and it looks like Joseph has a question. Jonathan, so what does planning process look like for one of these pages? Do you sketch out the different levels beforehand or let them emerge dynamically as you develop?
Yeah, great question. I kind of alluded to this a little bit a minute ago where assuming you're working with a client, they probably don't care about most of these stages that we looked at. They probably, until somebody starts reporting bugs. They probably don't care about the design. They just want it to work. The place where they usually care about the design is on the phone that they have. And the client probably has an Android phone, or the client probably has an iPhone. So they're going to worry about that design, and that's the design that everybody's going to go back and forth about and move the nav over here, and it's a little clunky, and could the animations be a little quicker, and they'll go nuts on the particular device they have or the particular suite of devices that you've agreed to test on. So I don't feel like you generally have to go through a design phase for every single one of these levels, because those are client. In my experience, the client just doesn't care about. They just think, oh, I don't care about those people, and it's almost more of me just feeling like religiously about not failing for people with older phones and weaker devices. So the design process, the responsive design process in general, is a very tough thing to do because the client has to kind of give up some pixel perfect control, and they don't like doing that, but that's the nature of the beast. So generally what happens is you do designs for small, medium, large width, and just use style tiles or element collages to come up with general typography rules and grids and that sort of thing. And it's tricky and it's new, and it takes a mindset change from the client. They have to release a little bit of control. So it's hard, but I guess the big thing I'm saying is I generally don't have to design each one of the enhancements. You probably just have to design the last one and then work your way up to it.
All right, and to finish the webcast questions, David Groom would like to know any new books on the horizon.
Good question. The jury is out right now. I definitely have. I've got some videos. If you are more interested in these types of things, you can go to my site and click on. Go to jonathanstark.com/leap, and I have I think 8 or 9 hour-long videos that are basically similar to this webcast, but go more in depth on specific topics. I would love it if people would subscribe to my newsletter so I can let you know if and when a new book is ready to roll out. That's at jonathanstark.com/subscribe. And everyone, please feel welcome to tweet me on Twitter, because I love answering questions on Twitter. It's probably the quickest way to get a good answer from me real fast. I can either point you in the right direction or just answer it real quick. So hit me up on Twitter at Jonathan Stark, or subscribe to the mailing list.
All right, everyone, that's it for today's webcast. Let's thank Jonathan for his time and excellent presentation. And as a reminder, we will have this webcast archive up within 48 hours. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to have you with us in future webcasts. Again, thank you, Jonathan. It was great.